Hello and welcome to our 18th weekly Time for Action webinar. We've been at this since early January, and we're going to take a little break after this one, but we've been doing them every week, and thank you for all the people who've joined. My name's Ken Johnson. My colleagues Kathleen O'Hara, Rolly Montpellier, and I are all on the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin people, also known as Ottawa. Today, we're talking about political lobbying and influence. Our two guests have years and years and years of experience watching the impact of lobbyists on government decisions and our democracy itself, and with a real angle on it, insider angle on all this. From 1973 to 2000, Kevin Taft worked in various public policy roles in the Government of Alberta, private and nonprofit sectors in the areas of health, energy, and economic policy. He's the author of 5 books and many research studies and articles on political and economic issues in Alberta. In the mid to late 1990s, Dr. Taft wrote 2 books critical of the ruling progressive conservatives, causing Ralph Klein, the Alberta premier at the time, to insult him in the Alberta legislature. That got on his craw. This solidified Taft's desire to run for office to defend his perspective on public policy. He was an Alberta Liberal member in the Legislative Assembly from 2001 to 2012, and the official leader of the opposition from 2004 to 2008. Kevin continues his career as a best-selling author, speaker, and consultant. His book, Oil's Deep State, is exactly why we're having him on today. I was at his book launch when he was in Ottawa 2 or 3 years ago, and was so impressed I bought the book then, and of course read it, and then encouraged my colleagues to read it because it's an incredible book. Kevin's probably been called many things, I guess, and his wife, including his wife, refers to him as an accidental politician, and Avi Lewis suggested he was the ultimate insider outsider. Duff Conacher is an internationally recognized leader in the area of democratic reform and government accountability. He's also a former Ralph Nader's Raider, a graduate of the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law. He has longstanding interest in the democratic process and corporate responsibility issues. He was the main founder of Democracy Watch in 1993 and has seen the organization win more than 180 changes to federal and provincial laws, more changes than any other organization in Canada. Unfortunately, our poster said that he left Democracy Watch in 2010, which he did, but he's back again. I think he came back in 2014-ish, and he's come back again as the coordinator. Duff is also the co-founder of the leading national civics education charity, Democracy Education Network, in 1993. And he has 2 kids, elementary school kids, I think he said at home, so he knows what he's talking about there too. And heads the goodorg.ca consulting. I've suggested that if Duff wanted time to vent about his 2 children at home being educated, we would give him that opportunity. Kathleen will interview Kevin and Duff, as is customary on Time for Action, for about 30 minutes. And then I'll ask some questions before Rolly and I read some questions from the audience. So over to you, Kathleen. Looking forward to a great session.
Thanks, Ken. Hello and welcome to our viewers and our 2 very, very knowledgeable and dedicated guests. We're going to examine political lobbying today. I'm just wondering how each of you would define it. Kevin?
Well, lobbying, there are legal definitions, and Duff, I'm betting, can rattle those off, but essentially lobbying is a private interest or individual communicating with a public office holder, and a public office holder can be an elected official, can be a civil servant, can be any number of other publicly appointed officials, and a private individual meeting or communicating one way or another with that public office holder to try to influence policies or decisions or legislation. So there are definitions laid out in legislation. That's my sort of off the top of my head description.
Duff, what do you think? How would you define it based on your years of watching it?
Well, every voter is a lobbyist because on at least one issue, voters want some action by government. But the formal definition of lobbying is when you communicate with a public office holder, whether it's a politician, their staff, or a government employee, your concern and wanting to push for something. And doing that on an individual basis is what voters have a right to do. Back to when the Magna Carta was negotiated by the British Lords and the King, one of the things in the Magna Carta was the right to petition the King for action on an issue. So that's a foundational document that underscores and underlies our constitutional right to petition our members of parliament and government officials. And then you have every type of organization organized to lobby, whether it's a business or business associations, like industry sector associations, like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or unions or nonprofit advocacy groups or charities, or individual volunteer local organizations that do lobbying. So those are organized efforts, and that's what most of the lobbying laws try to capture, is those organized efforts, unfortunately though with a lot of huge loopholes.
Well, how widespread is it on Parliament Hill, for example? I heard that the number of lobbyists increased under Harper. Is that true, Duff?
It's really difficult to measure that because a couple of loopholes were actually closed by Harper, and the enforcement strengthened at that time, mainly because of a court case that Democracy Watch spent 9 years in court winning. And that increased the enforcement of lobbying. And so you saw more people registering because they were lobbying illegally by not registering their lobbying and lobbying in secret. So it's really difficult to tell whether that was because of Harper being prime minister or because of this strengthening. I think it was the strengthening of the rules and the strengthening of the enforcement that really caused more people to register.
Oh, so you're saying there was a lot of informal lobbying, and we just found out the numbers because of the registrations. Kevin?
Yes, yeah, and that informal lobbying continues, again, because of these huge loopholes that still exist in the law.
Do you know, Kevin, do you know anything about the effectiveness of the legislation from your angle?
Well, I think the, you know, as Duff says, there's lots of loopholes in it. The lobbying legislation, even when it's followed, the description, for example, of you know, just going through some documents yesterday, the description of a meeting between a top oil executive and a member of the Harper Prime Minister's office was simply described as, the topic was environment. It was one word, that's all. So you have no idea what they were actually talking about. So you know there was a meeting. You have absolutely no details about it, and I think we also need to place lobbying within the broader issue of influence, and there are so many ways of deliberately influencing governments that don't particularly rely on lobbying. So I think we need to put this all in a broader context.
What about the lobbying and ethics commissioners? Is there no one controlling whether it's lobbying or influence, Duff?
Well, there are these two people, the Commissioner of Lobbying and the Ethics Commissioner at the federal level, both of them handpicked by the Prime Minister through secretive, dishonest processes. Democracy Watch has an access to information request in. We've been waiting almost 3.5 years now for the Cabinet Office, which is called the Privy Council Office, to disclose communications concerning the selection process for the lobbying commissioner. We challenged both of the appointments in court because both commissioners were investigating Trudeau and or his cabinet ministers when they chose new people. So right in the middle of investigations, Trudeau replaced the judges as to whether he and his cabinet ministers and their lobbyist friends had violated the laws. And the federal court ruled that they were biased when they chose these people. Of course, they're choosing their own judge. Of course, they were biased, but that it was legal for them to do that because these commissioners are like any other tribunal, and the Supreme Court of Canada ruling, unfortunately back in 2001, said that when when cabinet sets up a tribunal or watchdog like this, they're allowed to be biased and choose who they want, and don't have to have any qualifications for these people unless they're enforcing a law like the parole board, where it's someone's charter right is at issue. So we appealed that right up to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately the Federal Court of Appeals ruling was upheld, and they can choose their own lapdogs, and have. And these lapdogs have let about 80% of people off the hook since they've been appointed, that we know have actually violated the rules. So it's continuing a long line. Harper chose his own lapdogs as well. And the enforcement is unfortunately, as a result, very weak, and everyone knows it. So you combine that with the loopholes. And if you want to lobby in secret and lobby unethically, you can do it because of the loopholes. And even if you get caught, you probably won't be found guilty because you have a lapdog who is enforcing those weak loophole-filled rules.
Duff, you paint a really pretty picture of our democracy. Kevin, do you think that with the climate crisis, oil and gas lobbying has become more intense now that the government is being forced to choose between oil and gas profits and the future of the planet?
Well, yes. I mean, the oil industry is in a fight for its life, and it knows that. It's one of the things that's very hard to get your head around is the scale of this industry. So this is $100 billion industry. This is an industry in Canada that's bigger than almost every government in the country, other than the federal and Ontario and Quebec governments. It's immense. It speaks through lobbyists. It hires the most sophisticated insiders, anybody it wants. It's got the money to bring on board. And beyond that, Kathleen, it works to set the agenda through having a host of funded think tanks and institutes constantly putting out oil-friendly messages. It stages public consultations across the country with pretty much predetermined outcomes. So lobbying is one arrow in a very large quiver that the industry has, and it uses everything it can. It has the money to do that, and it has the incentive to do that.
Well, considering our emissions haven't ever been, our targets have never been reached in terms of emissions cuts, they seem to be fairly successful. Duff, who are the main lobby groups that you know of on the Hill and elsewhere who are really trying to stop the climate crisis being dealt with?
Well, as Kevin mentioned, it's the associations, the companies themselves, then their association, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. But then they also have these think tanks who are kind of lobbying, not directly, but are putting out the industry's propaganda through reports that hit the front pages and get reported. So you add that up along with their advertising, and then the overall associations of businesses, like the Canadian Association of Council of Business Executives. It's coming at the government from a lot of areas, and it's the same in every single business area. Consumers pay when you fill up your car with gas or have it in your home. Part of that price, you're paying for all the advertising, the lawyers, the lobbyists, the donations to the think tanks, the donations to political parties, the wining and dining and gifts and the fundraising events. All of that is being paid for by consumers. So we're funding the advocacy of the industry. And as a result, it ends up being very unbalanced because they gather all this money from us, and it's not coming out of the multimillionaire executives' pockets to fund all this advocacy. It's coming from us. And they get to write it off as well. The cost of lobbying is tax deductible for businesses. So in every single industry, not just this one, it's the businesses themselves and their industry associations and everything else they fund, lobby groups to, and even so-called astroturf groups to push for their agenda. And it's all, again, funded by consumers.
Kevin, I want to get into more detail about, for example, Natural Resources Canada and the influences on some certain departments. But you've mentioned political influence. What do you think is happening to our democracy with everything both you and Duff have said? Because I don't think most Canadians have any idea how rigged a game this is. Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I came to understand democracy, one frame of understanding it when you're on the floor of a legislature or parliament in question periods and so on, which probably everybody has watched on television or not in action. It's very much a contest, and some sides are much better resourced than others. But for all its weaknesses, I'm still a big champion of democracy. I mean, we have to fight back. We have to understand there's no end to this struggle. Our grandchildren and their grandchildren will be struggling. It's, Duff mentioned the Magna Carta. We can go back to the Magna Carta. And ever since then, the whole history of democracy has been a struggle for control of the state. And that's not going to end. Duff has spelled out the game is somewhat rigged. But I don't think anybody should see that as, and clearly none of us here do, see that as a reason to just give up. We have to continue to fight, and often we have successes. So democracy, there's lots of room for improvement, and we need to keep working on that. I would just say don't give up to anybody.
But Kevin, you write in your book that one lobbyist actually threatened you. Is that very common? I mean, how dirty do politics get in this country, I wonder?
Yeah, I mean, politics it's a rough game. It's a rough business. And when there's, billions and billions of dollars at stake, or even a good deal less than that, people will play rough. The meeting I describe in my book was, a situation where a fairly aggressive senior executive, basically told me to get with the program, or things will happen. And he didn't mean physically. He meant, your political party will be wiped out. And pretty much they were as good as their word. I mean, funding was cut off, and we didn't compromise, and so we paid a price. And certainly I was in a number of meetings with senior executives who at times would raise their voices and pound the table and try to bully. That was not common. It happened a number of times, and I guess you sort of, when you're in a political leadership position, you assume that's just part of the process. Most corporate executives and their advisors are sophisticated enough to knife you in the back instead of in the front. I'll put it that way. So you leave the room thinking, well, that went okay, and then you discover it didn't. Oops.
Duff, during your many years as an effective watchdog, have you experienced anything similar to what Kevin was just describing?
No, it's more just dismissive statements from ministers saying, who is that person, or who do they represent? Whenever I go before committee, the committee members are always asking about, do you have any supporters? Can you prove you have supporters? Why should we listen to you? And things like that. And everyone should realize how controlled those processes are. If there is an independent voice amongst MPs standing up for something at a committee level, then you won't see them at the next meeting. They'll just be replaced by the party leader. That happens all the time. If they hint they're going to vote against something that doesn't toe the party line, then they're just replaced at the next committee meeting. The party leaders have control over the committee members. Every party leader does, and they will replace independent voices. They don't want them as part of the process.
Well, Below 2C just put out a press release about the fact that Bill C-12 just had 9 hours in the Environment Committee hearings. So things can be cut short for various reasons.
Also,
But getting back,
yes, also in a minority government, it's more difficult. But if a couple of parties want to cooperate even in a minority government situation and close off debate, then it can be closed off as well very easily. In a majority government, even easier.
well, the Bloc and the NDP, I've heard, behind closed doors, supported the Liberals. But getting back to lobbying in particular, Kevin, you talked about various public institutions being captured in quotation marks by private interests, presumably in part by lobbying. What do you mean by this, captured?
Well, this is where the context for lobbying becomes a lot broader. What I mean by captured, and it's a fairly widely used term, is when an institution, a democratic institution set up to serve a public interest, ends up instead serving the interest of say, the private industry. So, a very easy example in the case of Alberta is the Alberta Energy Regulator. This is a regulator with a history going back to the 1930s in various versions. And in its legislation, it had right in the preamble to protect the public interest of Albertans. About a decade ago, the legislation was rewritten. The reference to the public interest was deleted. The regulator now, and this is one of the world's big energy regulators. Alberta owns the 3rd largest oil reserves on the planet. So, and this is the regulator for those oil reserves, which are owned by the public. But the regulator is 100% funded by the industry. So if you believe he who pays the piper calls the tune, right away, you should be worried. Its founding chairman was a very prominent oil executive. It's got exceedingly close ties to the oil industry. So that's an example of capture, Kathleen. And similar things, probably less blatant, but they're underway with universities, with organized, some branches of organized labor, with various civil society groups. And you could go on, political parties, the civil service. So we have to really be on our toes. So lobbying, lobbying is only a small part of a bigger campaign, as I keep saying.
Mm-hmm.
Duff, in your years in Ottawa, what was one of the more blatant, or if you saw any examples of capturing, what was one of the more blatant ones?
Well, the main area I would like to focus on in that is with fundraising. A lot of people think that problem has been solved largely across the country because there are limits on donations by individuals in most jurisdictions, although not Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, which are very much tied into this the fossil fuel industry, and also the Yukon. But we have these limits on individual donations and ban on corporate and union donations. But every jurisdiction where either the media or a regulator like Elections Quebec did an audit years ago, and where they've looked to see whether there is likely funneling of donations that are happening from businesses through their executives and family members to the parties. Every jurisdiction where that's been examined, they found funneling. Now they can't prove it because when you go to the corporate executive and their family members and say, did the business give you this money so you could donate it to the party? They say no, and of course the business says no as well. But where corporate and union donations have been banned, you've seen business executives start to give and their family members. Mm-hmm. And they're each giving the maximum, which in a lot of jurisdictions is a couple of $1,000s. And so you have 10 executives and their family members, each, their spouses alone, each giving, and boom, they've donated $40,000 to the party. The other thing that is very hidden and is also part of the lobbying effort that's broader that Kevin was outlining is that people can hold fundraising events as well. And if you get 100 people in your house and they each giving the maximum a couple of $1,000 donation, well, then you've raised $200,000 for the party. And for any party, that's going to be 5 to 10% of the amount of money they'll raise in a year. So you're suddenly responsible for 1/20th to 1/10th of the amount of money coming in. And you're going to get your calls returned. And that's all hidden. That is not disclosed in the lobbying registry. You don't have to disclose whether you've held a fundraiser for the party. The donation database that Elections Canada sets out does not show that as well. And so one of the most blatant ones was we had a lobbyist, for some reason, I have a guess as to why, but he invited us to, he was a former Liberal MP. His name was Barry Campbell. He was chair of the finance committee. He sent me the invitation to come to Jim Peterson, who was then the junior minister of finance, a fundraising event that Barry Campbell was holding for Jim Peterson. And the invitation letter read essentially very clearly saying, I'm the gatekeeper to Jim Peterson. And if you want to get through me to him, you come to this fundraising event. That's essentially what it said. You know, I'm organizing this on behalf of this junior finance minister. That's the case we took to court. And 9 years later, because there are ethics rules for lobbyists at the federal level who are registered, 9 years later, the Federal Court of Appeal ruled that that was illegal. And it's been illegal since 2009 at the federal level for lobbyists to do that for politicians. But they keep doing it because, again, it's secret whether they're holding a fundraising event for the party in their home. And those don't usually get covered by the media because they're at a private event in someone's home. So all these loopholes exist that allow this secret unethical lobbying to continue. And I haven't even talked about the loopholes in the law that allow you to lobby in secret, which are even bigger than the ones that I've just described.
I know there are quite a few loopholes, and I wish we had more time to cover them, but I want to get back to capturing. Last week, we looked at the power of the nuclear industry over Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, and Gordon Edwards, our guest, said that it's basically captured, and that's why they're promoting small modular nuclear reactors. Kevin, you write about the closeness between NRCan and the fossil fuel industry as it was revealed during the Bruce Carson case. Could you, I mean, in your book, you show that it was incredibly close. There was not even an effort to hide the closeness. They were all on the same team. Could you just give us the details of that? Because it's pretty appalling.
Yeah, I can give you some details. I mean, the fact is, Kathleen, the tightness of the relationship would have remained hidden except for the court case against Bruce Carson. And one of the things that we should be grateful for in Canada is that evidence in almost every legal case is made public. So I was able to get my hands on hundreds of pages of emails and background documents and memos between the oil industry and the senior administration of Natural Resources Canada. And it just showed such a cozy relationship to the point where the most senior officials in Natural Resources Canada are talking explicitly about wanting to be in full alignment. That's a term they use, full alignment with the industry. That's a textbook example of capture. The barrier between Natural Resources Canada and the fossil fuel industry there wasn't one. I mean, they were actually, NRCan was relying on the industry, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and others, to actually draft material, their memos, to draft civil service memos and reports. And civil service reports would be vetted by the industry before the civil servants would finalize them. I mean, it was, as somebody who once worked in the public service, it was just so far offside. It was shocking. It was shocking. And so I'm not sure if Duff that is lobbying. I wouldn't count that particularly as lobbying, but it's certainly a very powerful form of influence.
Yeah. I would say it points to a kind of fatal flaw with our public service. And that is the top two levels of our public service are chosen by the ruling party cabinet. And everyone below knows that. Now, even if everyone below doesn't aspire to fulfill the agenda of the ruling party cabinet, and when this all happened, it was the Harper Conservatives, and they were completely pro fossil fuel industry. And Harper would move around these top two levels, deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers. Essentially, if they refused to do what the cabinet wanted, people would get moved. And he rotated them all the time at a much higher level than previous governments had, to put people in there who would do what the cabinet wanted. So we talk a lot about Canada's independent public service, but a lot of people don't realize that the top two levels, it's not a merit-based appointment, moving up through the ranks and showing that you're the best person who upholds the law and the public interest all the time. But those top two levels are appointed by the cabinet. And Justice John Gomery, who just passed away, who looked into the Liberals ad scam scandal back in the 90s, he recommended that those top two levels of the public service be a merit-based appointment by an independent commission, where the people would serve a fixed term and couldn't be fired by cabinet for any reason except for cause, to protect the public service from this kind of political influence right at the top. But the system we have is the ruling party, like they choose their own watchdogs and can choose lapdogs, they can also choose lapdogs for the top tier of the public service and install people who believe in the government's agenda entirely, and whether laws are broken or not, as they were in the case of Bruce Carson, who violated the lobbying laws by what he did. And also, I think Harper violated the spending laws by handing money to the center at the University of Calgary and installing Bruce Carson there as the head of it. It was just a layer cake of conflicts of interest and violations of key democratic good government rules.
Well, as if we haven't painted a bleak enough picture, Kevin, you talk about other institutions being captured, like universities, and you've presented, or you wrote about some examples. The courts can be captured, regulatory agencies, as you mentioned. Any public institution is vulnerable to capturing. Can you comment on that, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, it happens to varying degrees. And again, I don't want to get entirely bleak here. It's the world's bleak enough already. We don't want to make it any bleaker. I think we want to be realistic. So, I live a few blocks from the University of Alberta in Edmonton. It's one of Canada's biggest, most important universities, an excellent university. But at that university, if you believe their own literature, there's more than 1,000 researchers working on oil sands research at this one university. And there's been a massive building campaign over the last 20 years at that university, in the engineering school in particular. So you have a handful of people maybe in environmental studies or philosophy or something raising concerns about climate change. And you have a university, on the other hand, that's bringing in enough money to finance more than 1,000 researchers on oil sands. Well, it's a struggle for the university to maintain its independence there. There was a dramatic example of that about 3 years ago with when the university decided to give an honorary degree to David Suzuki, and who everybody knows is a very prominent environmentalist, very strong critic of the oil industry. The reaction to the University of Alberta was just, I've hardly ever seen anything so vicious and threatening and just extreme from the oil industry and its supporters. And they got through to people like the Dean of Engineering, who condemned the university giving Suzuki an honorary degree, publicly condemned it. I won't go into all the details. But in the end, the university administration, the president and the Senate stuck to their guns, and they gave David Suzuki the degree. But so that's when I say it's a contest. That was a tough contest. The university could have caved in. They didn't, but I think they've paid an extremely heavy price since then. I have reason to believe that they have lost literally hundreds of millions of dollars in financing because of that decision.
David was worth it. Duff, have you seen other, just generally other examples of public institutions being captured by private interests that we should know about? That all of us who think that all these institutions are free and public and independent, and they're not.
Yeah, well, returning to the Bruce Carson case, we didn't really give the details of that, but I think that's the best example. He was a senior advisor to Harper, and Harper installed him in this center at the University of Calgary and funded it. And it was there to produce propaganda for the industry, pretending to be an independent think tank. And we wouldn't know all of the details, and the commissioner of lobbying was not the one who caught him lobbying illegally. It was academics there, I believe David Keith and others, blowing the whistle on what was going on. And then some of the details came out about the lobbying. But again, not the watchdog doing their job to catch this. It was the media and public interest groups revealing this whole situation of trying to create this independent think tank, kind of like what Kenny created with government money after he was elected, this so-called Canadian Energy Center. Only this was the early version of it, installing it in a university and pretending it was an academic think tank when actually it was a propaganda lobby group funded by the federal government to promote and support the fossil fuel industry. So I think that's the best example we have.
Thanks. Kevin, before I turn it over to Ken for more questioning, people talk about a revolving door in terms of government and private interests. Is that a problem?
Yes. So I give a couple of examples. I mean, there is now, starting in the early 90s, the tradition got established in Alberta that the Minister of Energy would come from the oil industry. And so we had a series of energy ministers, and these are people, again, just to remind people who are not in Alberta, these are the ministers responsible for the third largest oil reserves on the planet, how they get developed, the royalty breaks, the regulations, all of that, coming from the industry, spending a time in the cabinet position regulating the industry or in charge of the industry, and then stepping back to the industry. Or you had other examples of, a well-known finance minister in Alberta while I was in the legislature who had no background in the oil industry, but there was a 6-month cooling off period for cabinet ministers once they retired. So they stepped out of government. They couldn't take any positions for 6 months. 6 months and 1 week after this minister retired, she was on the board of a large oil company and being paid very handsomely. I could find that out because the oil industry had to file that information in their reports. The similar kinds of things happen to some degree with civil servants. Moving up through the Department of Energy, getting hired into the industry, sometimes people from the industry being seconded into the civil service for a period of time, returning to the industry. So the idea of a barrier, a border between the public service and politics and industry, it gets broken down pretty badly. And we need to always be working to build it up and strengthen it.
Duff, your comments on the revolving door?
Yes, at the federal level, a minister, their staff, senior government officials, the minister has to sit out for 2 years from joining an industry, but only an industry that they had significant official dealings with in their last year of office. And they can lobby because of the loopholes. They can go and work for a business and lobby up to 20% of their time, which is essentially just less than 1 day a week, without having to register. So people might have heard about a 5-year ban on lobbying after you leave. It's not a 5-year ban on lobbying, it's a 5-year ban on being a registered lobbyist. And you can go out, and there's another loophole where you have to register if you're paid for your lobbying. Well, you do a contract where you do the lobbying for free and you get paid for your strategic advice. And then you don't have to register your lobbying. So the prime minister and any cabinet minister, top government official, can leave the government and lobby the government the next day, and in secret. So as well, Ken mentioned industry officials going into government and out of government. Well, at the federal level, that's called the Executive Exchange Program, and it's exempt from every ethics rule that applies to every other government official. So an executive can come in from any industry into the government for a while, leave and go back to that industry with a zero cooling off period. And it's all a formal program that is there with the federal government, exempt from every ethics rule. So it's a big problem. And then you combine that with the industry backing candidates for office that they want to see in office, because then that person could possibly become a minister. That's another whole way of influence, is just picking candidates and pushing them through their nomination and supporting them through their election to get people in there. The worst one I've seen was the lobbyist for Lockheed Martin, O'Connor, was pushed as, and then became Department of Defense, the Minister of Defense. And he was the former lobbyist for the defense industry. So that happens as well. The rules are weak, the enforcement are weak, the penalties are minimal if you are even able to get caught, because you have a lapdog who's handpicked by the prime minister or the ruling party cabinet who is not watching, because they've been handed the job not to watch. They were handpicked for that reason. And then even when you do get caught and it's in the media and they have to do something, 80% of the time they let the people off. That's how the system actually works.
I keep getting muted. Anyway, I'm going to throw you over to Ken, and thank you both very much. This has been, I think, a real wake-up call. I think Canadians need to know a lot more about their democracy. Over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Kathleen. I don't feel like asking any more questions, because I don't know if I want to know any more about how bad it is. You guys seem to know way too much about what's going on here. Anyway, and Duff, I think I don't know if you've written any books, but I think your next book should be Lapdogs and Loopholes. I'm sure it'll be a bestseller, man. Kevin, both of you have talked, and I'd like to ask Kevin this first, about, we framed the webinar as lobbying because of our naive, sort of slightly naively, but clearly from what all you two have been saying, it's this whole science of influence, which you both mentioned. I just wonder if you want to give, Kevin, maybe first give us just a real framing of the larger picture. We've sort of mentioned a few things, but maybe just a framing of it. Kevin first, and then maybe Duff.
Yeah, okay. This is something that's been growing for many decades, even many centuries, if you really wanted to go back. What we have is a very broad understanding. So when you have the kind of money that big industry has, you can hire, the biggest thinkers, the most sophisticated strategists, and they'll lay out a public relations campaign, which will include a little bit of lobbying, or maybe a lot of lobbying, but it will also include a whole bunch of other long-term strategies or tactics, which might include setting up think tanks. So, Duff and I have talked about a couple of examples. Another one is the School of Public Policy in Calgary, the University of Calgary, which was endowed by the oil industry. And its first executive director was a board member of Imperial Oil. So, a sophisticated public relations campaign will include, okay, we want to capture the intellectuals, we want to build our credibility, and then we want to gain some foothold in the political party. So as Duff says, will support particular candidates, and I've watched that happen in big time in Alberta. They'll want to influence the media, and so well, we'll have any good public relations campaign is going to have great contacts with reporters. And we'll wine and dine. I'll take Joe Blow, reporter, out for a lunch. And it's all very friendly. And most of the time, there's no threatening. It's just building relations. And then, well, there's some labor groups who really we should get on board here. And so you can see how it builds out. So you have this sophisticated, very extensive campaign of influence. And it's only available to organizations and industries with vast amounts of money and a long-term agenda. So the agenda of the oil industry in Canada has survived. It was there long before the Harper Conservatives, and it's still very active now. And in Alberta, it goes back, a whole lifetime. So these are strategies that are kind of beyond partisan. They don't really care too much which party's in power, as long as they're our friends, and they are very far-sighted.
Thank you. Duff?
Yes, I'm glad you termed it an effort employing the science of influence. There's a guy, the guru of that, Robert Cialdini, a prof from the US, who's documented the 6 most effective ways to influence people. And number 1 is reciprocation, as it's known. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Trading of favors. And so there is a lot of influence employed by the industry in that way, backing candidates, doing fundraising, donations to universities, think tanks, as we've talked about. And of course, everyone, politicians included, say, oh, well, that amount of money would never influence me. But it's just proven. I mean, essentially, when they're saying that, they're saying, I'm not human, because humans have been tested around the world. And if you want to have someone do something for you, you give them something or you do them a favor. It's the number 1 way to influence people. Another of the big 6 ways, and Cialdini has a great little video on YouTube, one of those whiteboard with magic marker that summarizes his book, The Science of Persuasion, is if they show him by doing tests, for example, have a bunch of people standing on a street corner pointing up to the sky, how many people will look up when they walk by? And the more people there are pointing up to the sky, the more people will look. So that's the effect of joining the bandwagon. When you have a bunch of think tanks producing reports saying the oil industry is essential to the economy and produces all of these great things, then that influences people as well. Ken had mentioned journalists. Well, Rex Murphy's probably the best example, was speaking before the industry at their events for years and years, and then was writing columns about it, defending the industry without any disclosure to readers of the columns that he had been paid enormous sums by the industry. And of course, when it came out, he said, well, that would never affect me. But he's just saying, I'm not human. It does affect you. So it's multi-pronged, and it is employing the science of influence, the science of persuasion, the advertising. It all uses this science and behavioral psychology to try to influence voters, to back the industry whenever politicians try to do anything to regulate the industry, and of course, to influence politicians and government officials directly.
Thank you. I know one of the things that came to light in the 2015 campaign, and I keep mentioning it to people, but most people don't remember it, is I think it was about, and both of you'd probably know better, it was outed that I think the person who was running Trudeau's campaign was actually an oil and gas guy, and or a lobbyist, and he was already writing emails about how to influence the new Liberal government before the election, the vote even happened. I wondered if either of you want to talk a bit more about that. Duff, you seem to be shaking your head.
No, Duff
sorry. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
It did come out actually, so that's the importance of an effective media, and I worry about the decline of journalism in Canada and around the world. yeah, this, I write about it in my book. And it's very much actually, Ken, as you got it. I don't know if we want to start naming names here. I don't know how we are on that, but the fellow involved, as I recall, is Daniel Gagne.
Our board, Kevin, our board of directors for Time4Action has no oil and gas lobbyists on it, so you're probably free to say whatever you want.
And he was very well connected into the energy industry. I'm trying to remember, he'd also served as in very senior public administration positions, and he was close with the federal Liberals and the Justin Trudeau campaign at the time. He ended up being forced to resign once this came out, because while the campaign was underway, just as you say, he was actually emailing people in the oil industry saying, hey, it looks like the Liberals are going to win here. If you want to get an early start on things, let me know your concerns. Words to that effect. So, yeah, it's this is a systemic bias that's into the system.
Yeah, and again, largely secret. Often you can know the background of someone. They put it on their LinkedIn page these days when they're serving on a political party campaign. But once they get into office, if he had become a staffer, it's legal for him to have investments through mutual funds in the industry and not disclose them. Members of Congress, people have probably read about stories in the Canadian newspapers about members of Congress being charged with conflict of interest, voting on things that they profit from. In Canada, they're also allowed to have financial holdings at the federal level through one loophole, through a mutual fund. The former Minister of Natural Resources, Greg Rickford, owned shares in a hedge fund that invested in the energy industry. And the ethics commissioner looked at it and said, well, it's legal actually. And not only that, but it was disclosed by and discovered by a reporter that he owned these shares. He doesn't have to disclose that he owns them. And people have probably heard about, oh, Trudeau has a blind trust, Bill Morneau had a blind trust, but they don't have to tell us what's in the blind trust. And it's not a blind trust. They know what they put in their trust. They get to choose the trustee and they get to communicate with the trustee when they set it up. So all they have to do is say, don't sell anything in it. And then they know what's in it through the whole time they're in office. And that's legal for every top government official, cabinet staff person, and cabinet minister at the federal level and across the country. That same loophole exists. So they're actually allowed to profit from their own decisions without us knowing that they're profiting.
Wow. I was going to say a joke. I was going to ask you about when you get outside of Canada, when you go to other places, I mean, is it any different anywhere else? And I was saying, well, obviously in Africa and Latin America, but after what you guys are saying, it may be more blatant there, but it's not clear that it's just more straightforward in the open than here. But I would like you to both, Kevin, first, maybe you'd like to tell us your perspective of where Canada fits in compared to, say, European Union or European countries or the US. I don't think we need to talk about Africa or Latin America today, but how are we worse off, better off?
I can't give a deeply informed answer to that other than what prompted me to write Oil's Deep State was some time I spent in Australia at a university there, where I was invited to do some research on the impact of the fossil fuel industry on democracy. And that led to my book. And I remember being quite startled to learn that the election financing rules in Australia are much more just a free-for-all than here. So the kinds of money that I would give a talk and I'd say, oh my goodness, the oil industry put in, $500,000 into a campaign, and I'd be shocked, and people would just shrug their shoulders and say, well, so what's the big deal? If you're talking 50 million, okay, but $500,000. So in some regards, Canada's doing well. I'm sure by other measures we're not. Maybe
How about the US? How about the US?
I'll see what Duff can say to that.
Okay. Duff?
Everybody, most people will know the Citizens United ruling in the US, which was profoundly important and distressing for democracy there. But Duff, over to you.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that in the US, corporate union, other organization donations were actually prohibited back to the mid-70s. And individual donations had a limit on them from the mid-70s on. So Canada putting limits on those bans that started at the federal level in 2004 was quite late compared to the US. The big thing in the US is the third-party spending, as it's known, interest group spending is unlimited. And that's a big problem. And it's, as a result, means that those campaigns, the US Supreme Court have said, oh, the money is not going directly to the candidate. The third party is deciding to spend their money in support of the candidate. So therefore, it's not a problem to have no limits on it. Of course, the candidate knows who's spending the money in their favor. So it's just another way of buying them off. In Canada, we've at least limited third-party spending, but the limits are very high. It's $500,000 at the federal level now, which allows you to do a massive campaign if you have the money to do it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, our donation limits on individual donations, they don't stop what are called bundlers, people who hold big fundraising events and have 100 people in the room giving the maximum and raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for a party. Those things still go on and they're not disclosed. The other way the US is actually better than us is that more than 30 states require lobbyists to disclose in round figures how much they're spending on a campaign. And we don't even require that up here, let alone limit it, what can be spent. And so at least they get disclosure down there of, on any issue that the business is usually outspending the citizen groups by 100 or 1,000 to 1. And that helps, of course, for people to be questioning the decision that the politicians make and whether the decision was actually bought. The Access to Information Act, the lobbying disclosure, and the lobbying ethics rules are also stronger in the US than in Canada.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Duff. I'm going to turn it over to Rolly for some questions from the audience, and I may ask some of them too. Go ahead, Rolly.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, as usual, I've been monitoring the activities of the discussion in the chat, and I can see there's quite a level of concern or distress even about how compromised our bureaucracy might be, and what do we do about it, and so on. And of course, there are quite a few questions in the Q&A, but one of the first questions was from Gail Greer, and she asked, what is the federal legislation that governs lobbying? Quickly, maybe I'll go to Duff.
Yeah, it's called the Lobbying Act. And there's the Registry of Lobbyists that's online and searchable, including monthly communications. Every month, lobbyists have to record some of their communications. It really should be called the Some Lobbying Act because it only covers some lobbying. I mentioned some of the loopholes. If you're unpaid, you don't have to register, so that's easy to arrange to do your lobbying for free and get paid for something else. All the loopholes are there to cover up business lobbying. If you're lobbying about the enforcement of a law and you're lobbying the regulatory agency that enforces the law, then you don't have to register that lobbying. Well, nonprofits, unions don't really do that kind of lobbying. It's all business lobbying. And then for the monthly communications, it's only oral and prearranged communications that have to be disclosed. So all the emails, and if you're thinking, oh, well, you could just file an access to information request and get that information from a minister's office. No, ministers' offices are not covered by the Access to Information Act. So all the emails, all the phone calls that are spontaneous, all the conversations on the back nine of the golf course, those are not captured by the lobbying registry. And then the other big loophole, again, it's only for businesses, not for nonprofit citizen groups, is if you're at a business and you're lobbying less than 20% of your time, then you do not have to be put in the registry. And so they could have 100 people lobbying 1 day a week, which is still a lot of lobbying. You're talking about just under 8 hours of full-time lobbying a week. And none of them have to be listed as lobbyists for the business. So all these loopholes, the federal government's known about it, all the federal parties have known about it. For 25 years, I've been going before committee 6 times now saying close these loopholes. and they're still open, and they're all there to hide big business lobbying under the Lobbying Act.
And that's why it's called it should be called the Some Lobbying Act. I like that. Ken, maybe I don't know if you wanted to alternate questions, but I'll go for the next one. Maybe you can ask one after that. The next one is from Maureen Bodie. And there are also similar questions from other participants, but she asked, can Duff or Kevin please speak, and maybe this one will go to Kevin, speak about the fossil fuel industry's influence on unions and education of union members, read a lack of urgency for addressing climate change. In other words, make the connection between lobbying and climate policy, or the lack thereof in Canada. So did you want to tackle this, Kevin?
Sure. I mean, the big oil companies and little oil companies have come to understand that their employees are a political resource. And, I think we have to remember, we have to have some sympathy for people who have spent their lifetime making a living in the oil industry. And it wasn't seen as a controversial industry 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And they're now struggling. Well, how do I make a living? How do I square my conscience with making a living? And often, you square your conscience with your living by accepting how you make your living. So we need some sympathy for those people. But the oil industry organizes and informs many of its employees, turning them into spokespeople for the industry. So, and the dynamics are pretty clear. If you want to keep your job, then you need to advocate for our industry. You need to write letters to the editor. You need to have conversations at the dinner table. You need to speak up at the Chamber of Commerce, wherever you are. And often the employees are given talking points and time off, or a bit of an allowance to join the groups. So I'm not sure this is getting the answer to the question, but essentially employees of oil companies are often encouraged to advocate for the company and to slow down action on climate change.
So there's quite an effect on climate change policy, obviously, from what you're saying. Ken, I'll ask the next one, and maybe both you, Duff and Kevin, it's a short question. In fact, I'm making it short. Can we still trust the bureaucracy, given the level of encroachment by lobbyists? So did you want to tackle this first, Duff, and then Kevin?
Sure. Well, I had mentioned this, what I think is a fatal flaw of our public service, which is that the top two levels, the deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers in every department, are chosen by the cabinet. And everyone below them knows that. And they can thwart anything that's coming up from below. Hide it, delay the release of it, even if there is an Access to Information Act and the public has a right to know it. Delay works. As I mentioned, we've been waiting 3 years for disclosure of something that the public has a right to know from the Trudeau Cabinet Office. Reporters across the country, the national media have concluded that our access to information system across the country is broken. And delay works. All you have to do is get through the next election round. So that's what deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers can do, and they're chosen by the ruling party cabinet. And there should be a merit-based appointment process for them so that they would be independent from cabinet, and they should have some job security as long as they're doing their job well. And then I think we would see them uphold the law, and it's a very important change that we need. I don't think we can trust the bureaucracy as a result.
What about you, Kevin? Are you of the same opinion?
I'm concerned about degrading public confidence in all these institutions too far. People should be skeptical, but in my experience, the great majority of people who go into the civil service, I'm sure Duff would agree, mean well, intend well. They're in many cases highly trained to professional standards, and and they do their best, and it is a compromised system. I've been in a situation exactly what Duff describes, where writing reports, they go up the channels, and the assistant deputy minister, the deputy, destroys them, literally in some cases. But I do believe this. I think we have to continue to have some faith in our public service. The Harper government became very cynical about suppressing public scientists. But those scientists kept working, and many of them have, returned to former positions with the opening up, with the change of government. So I don't want us to lose faith in our democratic institutions. I want us instead to believe that we need to strengthen them.
Thank you for that answer. Ken, did you want to ask a couple?
Yeah, I was wondering, Duff, do you want to talk a bit about your latest Democracy Watch initiative with, I think, 50 other groups stopping fossil fuel financing campaign? We've had people on about pensions from Shift. We've had people on about the big banks, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously it's a huge problem. Rolly's very involved in the fire your fossil bank thing, but maybe you could just tell everyone about what you're up to.
Yeah, there are a lot of groups, which is great. Greenpeace and Below 2C and many other groups pushing people to look at the banks. And we have our top 5 biggest banks ranking in the top 25 of the fossil fuel financiers in the world. This is work by BankTrack and Rainforest Action Network, and it's an international campaign. Now more than 70 groups signed on, calling on them to divest. What we're doing is something slightly different. We're pushing on Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He controls the securities laws of the stock exchange. And of course, she controls the Bank Act. And to put in place what's called for internationally is these international standards for just transparency and disclosing fossil fuel investments and loans. And we want these international standards made federal law so that every federally regulated financial institutions, the banks, the trust companies, the insurance companies would be having to disclose publicly their investments. And then further, we're calling for requirements that they end these investments, that they invest only in truly sustainable job creating businesses, and create citizen watchdog groups to watch over and empower financial consumers and investors to have a much greater say in their in what all these financial institutions are doing with their money. So it's a multi-pronged effort, international and domestic, pushing to inform Canadians about just how much our big banks are invested in the fossil fuel industry. And that's another prong that the industry has going for it, is that you do have all the big financial institutions who are huge lobbies in themselves and want to be doing these loans and investments, and they're backing the industry as well. So it's just another whole very powerful prong of the lobbying efforts of the fossil fuel industry in Canada.
Thanks, Duff.
As you know, Ken, I could go on for hours about fossil banks, but unfortunately, I'll close that door before I jump right into it. 211. I think we have one more quick question, and it has to do with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And it's a question from Tom Cullen, and he asked, given your remarks about capture, this will go to Kevin, do you have the impression about, or any impression about how truly independent the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is? And what evidence would you have of that?
You know, I can't give an informed answer to that. Maybe Duff can.
No, I don't know the details behind that particular institute.
No.
Yeah, it's fairly new, and I'm not 100% familiar with it either.
You know, my suggestion would be for the whoever has the question to find out, say, who the board of directors are, and do a little bit of research on who those individuals are, which can be done on the web pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And maybe see if you can find out where they get their money. Just follow the people, follow the money, and see where the trail leads, and that will help answer your question.
So to you, Tom, who's asking the question, I know Tom quite well. When you do that research, get back to me. I'd like to see what you find out about that. Back to you, Ken, because it is 2:13, and I think our guests said they were able to stay until about 2:15. So I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rolly. Kathleen, maybe I'll turn it over to you. Do you have any last thing you'd like to say?
First, I unmute. Well, this is our last webinar of, as Ken said, of 18. So I think we've ended our run brilliantly, because we've seen the banks, we've seen the pension funds, we've heard about big stall, how corporations and governments have been stalling on climate action. So I think this has wrapped things up beautifully. But of course, I understand Kevin's fear that we don't want to disillusion people completely. But I mean, knowledge is power. And most Canadians don't have enough knowledge, and we don't have enough power. So thank you both, and thanks to our viewers for sticking with us, some for 18 webinars. And over to you, Ken, to wrap things up.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, thanks. I'd just like to thank both of our guests, painfully and informative about the situation, but and I'd like to acknowledge too what Kevin said, that we can't give up on everything because it's still relative. So we set up Time4Action in the middle of this pandemic because we just thought, man, activists need to be keep more connected. There's so many things going on, especially around the climate, and this is the decade that really matters. So we just started on a whim. It was just Kathleen's idea. We should do this. And 2 weeks later, we were doing it, and we've been doing it every week since. So we're going to take a brief hiatus, and we'll be back at it, I can assure you. I'd like to really thank all the people who have joined us. We've had 75 to 150 people every week on this webinar, and I think everyone must have learned a tremendous amount, just like today. It's a very complex puzzle, and it's amazing how interconnected everything is. All the pieces fit, and I think to end it on this, well, what we called lobbying one, but really is the influence one, really is another level of understanding exactly why the government keeps doing what you wouldn't expect them to do based on any logic or science, or more importantly, what needs to be done for our children and for the planet. So
Ken, I'll just say, someone in the chat is asking, what am I going to do on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. from now on? So
well, Rolly, I think what we're going to do
I just thought I'd share that.
I think what we're going to do is send out a questionnaire and find out how often people would like to have it during the summer. We definitely won't be doing it every week, but we'll see whether people want to break or want to continue. We've got a list of another 15 or 20 webinars we could have with equally capable and competent guests doing incredible work in Canada around the climate issue on one aspect or another. And particularly, I think of right now, it's so heating up in the BC woods. It's incredible. We're back to Clayoquot Sound, 1989. I was just at the GoFundMe. I gave them some money, but the contributions are coming in about $250 a day. And they've now got about $420,000 to defend what's going on. So it's obviously capturing the imagination. So it'd be a great thing to do. So maybe we'll do one in a couple of weeks. But I also like to put a questionnaire out to all the people on Time4Action, see what they think about how often we should be doing it. So on that note, I'd like to just close it off. Thank you for all our viewers. As always, very appreciated that you keep following the stuff we're doing. And we'll be back. We're not disappearing. Thanks again, Kevin. Thanks again, Duff. I'm sure I echo what everyone in the audience feels, because I'm sure everyone learned a lot today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Stay well.
Take care. Stay
See you,
safe.
Kevin. See you, Duff.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.